Welcome to community meetings in the hybrid setting. My name is Anna Kay. I am a behavior support specialist with Albuquerque Public Schools, and I've created this webinar as a space to begin thinking about three areas of consideration. First, the importance of community meetings in the elementary setting. Second, ways to simplify the responsive classroom meeting structure to make it more accessible for teachers and students in the virtual or hybrid setting. And third, ways that we can safely and effectively transfer the community meeting ritual from our virtual learning space into a hybrid model. So, what is a community meeting? A community meeting is a dedicated time of togetherness. It's also ritualistic in nature. And this is important because trauma informed best practices indicate that routines and rituals provide a critical sense of safety and predictability for students. The community meeting is a perfect vessel for this much needed security. Community meetings are also preserved as a tool to build, maintain, and repair relationships. So that's peer relationships and also teacher to student relationships. They help to create a cooperative classroom culture, and they also provide a space where we can explicitly teach social and emotional learning competencies. Social emotional learning, or SEL, must be a cornerstone of all classrooms, particularly during these unprecedented times of uncertainty. We know that it can be a challenge to find the time to prioritize SEL in our classrooms, and a community meeting is an ideal place to really preserve time for SEL direct instruction. We're going to be using the term community meeting, but you may be more familiar with the term morning meeting. So, a community meeting can be held first thing in the morning as a morning meeting, or as a ritualistic daily closing activity, or really any time during the day. Right? The time of day is less important than the structure, the consistency, and ensuring that all students are included. So, if you have students who perhaps receive special ed services or are pulled out of your classroom for other reasons, try to find a time for your community meeting when everyone in your class is present, because this sends a really important message of inclusivity. So, the why. Why does the TLN, or the Teacher Learning Network, advocate for community meetings in the hybrid setting? First and foremost, these community meetings help to build relationships by creating authentic opportunities for students to engage with one another. They also help us to establish a routine that creates safety and predictability. And they help us to explicitly teach and practice social and emotional learning skills and community expectations. These components are pivotal when we are thinking about supporting the mental and emotional needs of all students in a holistic way. And we know that students may not be able to engage in rigorous academic content unless these needs are met first. So there are so many hybrid models and schedules available. For this specific session, we're going to be speaking to a station rotation hybrid model. Now, this may not be the model that your school decides to adopt, but please know that community meetings can work in any hybrid plan with some basic tweaks and modifications. But just for the sake of some common understanding and framing, we're going to be talking about integrating a community meeting into a station rotation model where there are two groups of students. Group A is in person at school, face to face with us, and Group B is joining us virtually. In this particular model, a teacher would be engaging with groups A and B every day. So we can think of this kind of like a small group rotation, like you would use in your daily 5 reading schedule. So we know it's important to include all students in community meetings. So let's imagine that we're going to create a morning meeting or a community meeting where some students are in class face to face and some students are viewing us, the teacher, through their Google Meet. With that framework in your mind, let's move forward on how we're going to structure this meeting. So many of you are probably very familiar with the responsive classroom morning meeting model. This model has four purposeful components: greeting, a sharing, a group activity, and a morning message. So in their book called The Caring Teacher, Gianna Cassetta and Margaret Wilson describe a more condensed community meeting structure, which includes a greeting, a discussion, and a cooperative activity. Today, we're going to be speaking to the model from the Caring Teacher book. One model is not necessarily better than the other. It's really up to the needs of the students and the teaching style of the teacher. So maybe your community meeting structure may be a combination of these two models, and that's great. I just want to point out that our model today is just going to be kind of a condensed structure from that responsive classroom model. So let's first talk about that greeting, that very important first part of our community meeting. So many students across our district and across the country are feeling the effects of isolation. We can begin to break down these walls of isolation by using a greeting in our morning meetings. The greeting is an opportunity for students to acknowledge one another by name. Students could also incorporate a handshake or a visual acknowledgement of the peer that they're greeting. This provides space for every child to hear their name and be acknowledged by a member of their community. This helps to build strong connections between students. It also helps to improve student engagement, motivation, and social as well as academic competence. Without intentionally carving out time for this, many students may go a day or even days without connecting with a peer. So let's think about how this could look in the hybrid setting in that station rotation model. So back months ago, pre-COVID, maybe we would have students engage in a handshake. But now we want to make sure that students are not touching one another, that they're keeping socially distant. So thinking about ways that we can incorporate maybe a distant handshake, right? This might be an air five or some sort of dance or body movement that is similar, ritualistic in nature, similar to a handshake, but that means that students aren't actually touching one another. We also want to consider how we can make a connection between the in-person students and the students that are joining us virtually. And thinking about ways that we can keep it fresh and interesting. And I'll give you some more resources here in a little bit about how to keep your greeting new and exciting. So let's think about the second part of our morning meeting, the discussion. So during a structured discussion, students can answer a question of the day or respond to a prompt orally. This can be done whole group, but it's really most impactful when students are able to work in pairs or triads. Discussions can be about likes or dislikes, familial history, academic content, or social emotional in nature. This helps students to form relationships with one another, find common interests, and practice important communication skills that are transferable to other academic tasks. So when we're thinking about using a discussion in the hybrid setting, we want to think about the whole group discussion versus those pairs or triads. So maybe in the beginning, it makes more sense to have a whole group discussion. That might help with bandwidth and just general logistics. And perhaps we can move to students discussing in pairs. So here in our picture, in our hypothetical classroom, we have some students who are socially distant, but they are engaging in this discussion together face to face. And then maybe we're using almost a breakout room format where we have some students who are in person, but they're talking to a peer, that group B, the group that's joining us virtually, on an iPad or a laptop. There are lots of different ways to do this. And if we're in the virtual setting right now, we might even start to give students the opportunity to practice this structure by using breakout rooms where we randomly assign peers and ask them to discuss. Again, it could be a prompt about things that they enjoy, things that they dislike, or any other discussion prompt that comes to mind. Again, we want these community meetings to also incorporate some SEL. So, thinking about discussion prompts that focus on SEL. That can be anything from goal setting to a time that students overcame a problem, to how students deal with frustration, or even discussing different emotions and what they feel like in our bodies. There are lots of ways to integrate SEL into these discussion prompts. And again, we want to make sure we're creating that connection between both our in-person students and our virtual students. And finally, the cooperative activity. So, the cooperative activity may be a short game, a shared reading, a musical experience, or any number of shared experiences between peers. Cooperative activities bring joy into the learning space. These activities help students to connect and cooperate with one another while also practicing important social skills such as sharing, turn taking, self control, problem solving, etc., and in a very non intimidating way. There's an expansive body of research that supports movement and rhythm as strategies that help to mitigate stress and trauma responses in both children and adults. So consider ways to incorporate movement and rhythm into this time. Maybe this is where you use an online resource such as Go Noodle, or maybe incorporate resources from your PE teacher or the music teacher at your school site. After students have been given the opportunity to practice the greeting, discussion, and cooperative activity, you may also consider asking for their feedback and input on modifying some of these activities. This gives space for student voice and agency, which is another way to boost that relatedness and engagement in your class throughout the school day. So when we're thinking about this cooperative activity, some hybrid considerations again might be that connection between in-person students and virtual students, how we're incorporating movement, rhythm, maybe dance or stretching, but in a safe way where students are socially distanced from one another. We encourage you to really use your imagination. Go back to those old school games that we played when we were kids as teachers. Simon Says, etc. And also, again, incorporating student voice and getting student input when designing these activities. So perhaps you might say, but I'm not teaching in hybrid yet. My students are still virtual. And this is a really great time to begin integrating some of these community meeting skills, systems, and procedures into your virtual learning time, right? It's going to be easier if students are practicing this now when they're virtual. That's going to make it easier to translate those skills into the hybrid or face-to-face setting. So we want to make sure we're thinking about foundational skills. So giving students the time to practice the basic skills associated with a successful community meeting will make the transition to hybrid model smoother. We also know that this time can create a really strong classroom community. Students are more likely to attend and actively participate in virtual learning when they feel like they're a valued part of a caring community. And incorporating a community meeting is one way to foster that. Also, these community meetings help to bridge SEL and relationship building because we know the mental and emotional health of students is a priority. Community meetings provide space to explicitly teach SEL skills and also help students to develop and maintain relationships with their peers, even if it is through a computer screen. So next steps. You may be starting your community meeting journey, or it may be just continuing it and continuing to develop it. So if you're already using community meetings, we encourage you to think about developing student skills necessary for a hybrid model, right? So how can I get my students ready to move this community meeting from the virtual space into the hybrid space? If this feels like too much right now, which is understandable because we all have a lot going on as we're thinking about transitioning to hybrid, I encourage you to just pick one element of the community meeting structure to focus on. So maybe if you're not using community meetings at all, you might say, you know what, I can start with a morning greeting where students have the opportunity to greet one another by name. That's a great first step. And if you still have questions or concerns, reach out to us for help. You can contact the Behavior Support Specialist team by email at bss@aps.edu. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you a couple more resources that might help with those questions or concerns. So here are some resources, one of which is The Caring Teacher by Cassetta and Wilson that was published in 2019. This is a really wonderful book for strategies for working through our own difficulties with students. I highly recommend it, and they talk a lot about community meetings and how they help to develop relatedness and competence in students. The Origins program is also a really wonderful online resource. If you are looking for ways to make your community meetings greetings new and exciting, they have so many ideas on how to switch up those greetings to keep students interested. And finally, the Responsive Classroom has a wealth of information about community meetings. They call them morning meetings, but again, we know those are interchangeable terms. I highly recommend exploring their website if the community meeting approach is new to you, or if you kind of feel like you're stuck in a rut in terms of your community meetings. Thank you very much for taking some time to spend with us. Again, we encourage you to reach out to our behavior support specialist team by email and also follow us on Twitter. You can reach out to me directly. Again, my name is Anna Kay, and you can find my email address there on this slide. I would love to keep this conversation going and learn about ways that you are incorporating community meeting into your virtual and hybrid space. Thank you for all that you do for students across the district.